The Olympian Gods. There are a number of excellent overviews of the Olympians, who they are, all of the different attributes in the stories, and that sort of thing. And so for the lecture today, instead of focusing on specific stories, I want to bring out ways of understanding them and interesting details with respect to, how it is that we can understand and interpret the ancient Greek stories. So the first thing that is worth saying, and the first thing to note in discussing polytheism in general, and I've been at pains to make this point a number of times, and it's a difficult thing for us to wrap our minds around, so it's worth restating, is that the Olympians, one way of understanding the Olympians and polytheistic deities generally, is that when we think about the divine as being a part of everything in the world, then we can look at the different portions of the world as more or less divine according to certain characteristics. In other words, instead of just thinking about divinity as being the monotheistic God who is supernatural, above everything, beyond everything, creates everything, we can think about divinity as being the entirety of the world experience, the entirety of the world, both seen and unseen, all that is possible, all that is, was and will be, and all of these sorts of things. So in other words, not just a strict pantheism in terms of God is equal to the material world, but when we look out and we see a tree that's growing, we can think in terms of the tree itself, so perhaps some kind of divinity related to plants. We can think in terms of growth and becoming, birth, and so divinities related to birth, death, growth, maturation, fructification, giving life to other things by way of food, and these sorts of things, the harvest cycle, the seasons, all of these concepts, any of our concepts and names and ideas can be divine. And this is where we have the hardest time, I think, in the West, the modern West, in understanding polytheism and understanding the ancient Greeks, is that we don't tend to think about the natural world as divine in the same way. But if instead of thinking of God as something removed and something, the Deus absconditus, the hidden God, instead of thinking of God as something hidden, we can think of God and the divine as something manifest in all of creation. And indeed, this is done even in Christianity in certain circles, in medieval circles. I'm just talking about fringe elements. So that when we see a tree, when we see a plant, let's say a corn plant or something would be better, since this is associated specifically with not only agricultural societies but with food. And so this is going to be a terribly important deity. With the Greeks, we can trace this lineage perhaps through Ceres, the Magna Mater, Demeter, and Persephone. Persephone specifically is fairly obviously associated with the cycle with respect to the harvest. And so it's not hard to think of Persephone as a corn maiden in that way. Someone who is linked with the idea of growing food at a specific time, something that doesn't happen during the winter. This is the period of decay when she would be trapped in the underworld and then only available for a few months out of the year for reuniting with the life-giving properties of the flowering plants, the food-giving plants. And so these sorts of cycles, instead of just thinking about them in mechanistic terms the way that we're accustomed to doing so, and one might even be tempted to say secular terms, so a secularized version of these things, where we think of them purely as physical phenomena, such that I plant a seed and it grows according to certain physical laws. This is not at all the way that the ancients saw the world. For the ancients, when a seed burst into bloom as a plant and became something that was capable of sustaining life, all of these different aspects were divine. and they were divine in different ways. And so if they're divine in a way of childbirth and this fruit giving, fruit understood in terms of children and offspring, then we can think of it in terms of Demeter and the Magna Mater, the Great Mother, the Earth Mother. And as that food is taken in by way of ritual, and indeed we'll see with the mysteries as well, where this is crucially important, then it can be associated with other gods. And if there are gods that are involved in the ritual, like let's say the Dionysian elements of wine and this orgiastic ecstasy, working oneself into a trance and that sort of thing, then we might associate that aspect of things with a different god. But the point is here, instead of all trying to get to this hidden God, this supernatural thing that all of these rites and rituals are meant to get to, and we can understand Christianity in that way. That's one way of interpreting things. With the Greeks, what we see instead is a divinity attached with each aspect of life. And so when I feel love, there is an experience of Aphrodite. When I feel anger, when I remember something, when I go to sleep, so we might have Ares and Mnemosyne and Hypnos. The different divinities are associated with different activities. And it's not as though you have this, and this is too often the way that we see it, this collection of divinities as though it were just this other, civilization of people living on top of Mount Olympus and influencing things like, a puppet might pull the strings a puppeteer might pull the strings of a marionette. The divinities are infused in those activities, associated with those activities. And so what we see then is not a world that is controlled by these kind of chaotic and amoral gods that are just other and other people. They're not us, but they are other things. Instead, what we have is a much more intimate relationship with respect to how it is that one can experience the divine. And I remember Joseph Campbell telling a story one time with India, in saying that there was a famous guru who came over to the West after from India, and said that people are asking me, how can I get to God? How can I come to experience God and the divine? And this is a Western thing, because he says in the East people are experiencing God all the time. You just walk outside and there it is. And this is really the difference that I want to focus on with polytheism and with ancient Greek polytheism in particular, such that the world is just full of gods and one is constantly experiencing the effects of the gods. And so this is not, and the gods themselves, not just the effects of the gods. So this is not something that one has to have faith in the same way that one has to have faith in a hidden God. If a God is hidden, and again, this is I'm harping on this term for good reason, because this is a big transition in religion. The Deus absconditus, the hidden God. When the divinity becomes hidden and removed from the world, this is what Joseph Campbell called mythic dissociation. A technical term that he introduces, which I think will be useful, so I'll reuse it in this context. So when the world becomes mythically dissociated, such that the profane world is truly profane and is no longer full of gods, then we have a very different kind of religion. And so for the ancient Greeks, what I will put to you is that that's not at all what's going on, that instead there, we don't have hidden gods, we have gods that are forever manifest. They're everywhere manifest. And one cannot do anything without feeling the divine all around you and experiencing the divine in a variety of ways. And so what they are doing is walking around in a world full of deity, full of the divine. And so when one goes to a temple of I don't know, pick your favorite god. I'm trying to think of one that would be representative. Hestia is common, of course, because the goddess of the hearth, but we have difficulty identifying with that. Hermes, Hera, Aphrodite, Ares, although his worship was not terribly common, which is kind of amusing. The god of war. So anytime you go into these temples, it's not as though one enters sacred space and one was not previously involved with the gods at all. This might be the impression that we get, and certainly this is the kind of relation that someone like Mircea Eliade is going to want to emphasize, that you have the sacred world, you have the profane world, and there are certain interactions and whatnot. But as we move further and further into traditional society and farther away from the mythic dissociation of Western religion, then we get, I think you'll find, closer to a world that is full of gods, one that is suffused with the divine throughout, and that one cannot get away from the divine in that way. And so, in other words, so let's put this in a bit more prosaic terms. Let's back up a bit. If I am experiencing, I wake up in the morning, I come out of the influence of hypnosis, sleep, I remember that, I want to see this particular beautiful girl today. And so I remember by way of mnemosyne, my feeling of love might be influenced by Aphrodite. My feelings of lust might be influenced by Eros, her offspring, interestingly. So I go and see this person, and I am consistently and throughout involved in an interplay of what we would call emotions that are local to a particular person. We think about those emotions as being kind of inside the skull and inside the individual. Whereas the polytheistic world, this is going to be something more widespread in terms of I am under the influence of Aphrodite, and so there is not as much of a brain-body boundary between the brain and the outside world. So we don't think about the individual in those societies as being local to here, but much more spread out. The metaphor that I liked very much that I read in environmental philosophy recently was that of the low fence. And the idea there is that there is a low fence between the individual and the outside world, such that the fence can be easily traversed and is traversed commonly for different things. And one might picture a very porous picket fence where small animals can easily get in and out of, one can easily step over, and that sort of thing. And this is the way that one can leave the individuality that one has with respect to the ego and become something else for a time, be under the influence of different gods and eternal, really archetypal influences, such that I am not myself in a strong sense. The identity of who I am, the me, the I, is something smaller in that society, and so I can leave that as I enter into the sanctuary, the temples and sacred spaces, and partake in rituals and that sort of thing, and then I return to my own contingent individual manifestation later, which is really much less important. The more important aspects are going to be those associated with the archetypal, associated with the various divinities. And so instead of thinking about the anger and the love and the lust and all of the things that I feel as being local to me as a person, as an individual person, and something that is peculiar to me as an individual, instead of doing that, I instead think about myself as constantly moving in and out of various divinities and no longer being, myself. What I consider to be myself is only a small part of the experience of the world and all of the events in the world and the various manifestations of things. And so the individual in that way is much smaller in those societies than it would become, and certainly is for us. Now, as we'll see with the phenomenological accounts of religion, now we really have a tough time trying to imagine how it is that this kind of world could be seen in that way, how it is that we can see the world as full of gods, and participation is something being more than just a mere metaphor, something more than just a rhetorical figure where I say I am like Aphrodite or I am like Ares, but still, well, the anger is still mine. This is not at all the way that the ancient world and traditional societies, polytheistic societies, would have seen things. There's a more porous interaction there between the individual and the outside world and other individuals and these sorts of things. And so individual identity is not so much contained in the brain. as it is spread out and able to, absorb and have interplay with all of these different elements. So that's the chief obstacle, I think, for us understanding these things. Now, in light of that, let's take a look at some of the Greek deities and the 12 Olympians in particular, even though who those 12 are varies somewhat between stories. So the first thing that I want to tell you is that the Olympians themselves, not only did the Olympians vary between stories, but a lot of what happens varies between stories. And so if you go out and you listen to, your average YouTube lecture on a movie on, Ares, the god of war, or, Hera or Zeus, then you're likely to hear specific stories as though those were the only ones. But in fact, there are a great many accounts. And this is where things can get very confusing. Because while there is certainly a great deal of commonality between the stories, it is by no means consistent in any way. There's a great deal of disagreement between the different legends. And so the different versions of the legends. And so while we have some kind of broad brush titles that we can associate and ideas that we can associate with particular divinities, there are by no means, authoritative versions of the stories. I mean, there are many versions of the stories, many of which are just explicitly incompatible with one another. And so this is not so much a problem for the ancient Greek world. Again, if I'm thinking about love as manifest in Aphrodite, whether Eros is her child or not, or whether, whatever the interaction is, that's less important because this is not a historical religion. This is not a religion that has significance because of the individual pieces of all of these relations. But instead, it's the way that all of these things are experienced. So while one can challenge whether or not Eros is the offspring of Aphrodite, one cannot really question love itself. So disbelieving in Aphrodite would amount to disbelieving in love itself in some sense. And so it just doesn't even make any sense. And so the question of belief and faith just doesn't arise in these contexts in the same way. In proportion to when it does arise, this is where we really see changes in the religion. And by Plato's time already, we start to see this sort of thing. And in fact, this was a problem to the point where Socrates was put to death for the corruption of the youth, specifically with respect to this kind of thing. And one of the charges is, disbelief in the gods. And so, already by that time, this is 400 BC, it's a problem. Prior to this, increasingly so as we move backwards in history, it doesn't even make sense. The question of belief doesn't even make sense. One simply goes out and experiences these things, and it would be ridiculous not to believe in love or to believe in anger because they're just there. So this is a bit more prosaic version of the divine. By our standards, we typically think of the divine as, kind of out there and beyond and above all human and contingent concerns. But it doesn't have to be that way. And in the history of religion, this presents a major obstacle for us trying to understand other cultures in freighting in this particular conception of the divine and assuming that it holds for everyone. Okay, so with the different gods, we're going to see... let's come back to Zeus because he is kind of an interesting and potentially problematic example. Hera. What is Hera the goddess of? And this is kind of an interesting question. And she is manifested principally in wrath and is a patron of married women and has a great deal of problems, of course, with Zeus and his infidelity and that sort of thing. And this is the story as it comes down to us. So she is associated... with that aspect, with that very real and tangible aspect of human life. Aphrodite, of course, love, Ares associated with war, but a cowardly god. And it's interesting that Ares is seen as cowardly, and some of his cowardice comes from his being very easily provoked, very easily offended, easily warlike, very easy to understand, I think, how it is that these attributes might be associated with him. And so, again, what we should think in terms of how we should understand the various conceptions of the divinities, when we learn of their attributes, frequently you'll find that they make a great deal of sense, and the lineage makes a great deal of sense. Again, eros, desire, sexual desire specifically, being the child of love, of Aphrodite, and this makes a certain amount of sense that these two should be related. So this is what we're going to encounter consistently. And then when you have powerful deities, frequently these are deities of things that are outside of control or threatening to civilization in some ways. The sea is something that is threatening to civilization. It is untamable. Poseidon's realm of the ocean is untamable. You can't build anything on it. The sea is forever swallowing up people, and water has just a tremendous amount of force that is capable of destroying people very easily. And you really have to put yourself out there to engage in a sea voyage. And so it's not surprising then that we see Poseidon as irascible, and also as, striking his trident to the ground and creating earthquakes. And likewise, earthquakes are out of our control. They threaten civilization, and when I say civilization, I mean order. So the order that we try and create in terms not only of political order, social order, but also order in terms of just putting rocks together and building a house. All of these things are threatened by the chaotic elements. And so it's natural then that Poseidon should be associated with those different realms. And, on and on and on with the different deities. Learn about the individual domains of the various Olympians and the various pieces of Greek mythology. And what I hope to do in the lecture is to be able to give you some kind of glue to tie all of these things together, and to help you to understand not just these stories as stories of people, as if Ares and Aphrodite and Hermes and Hephaestus and all these were just, people that lived out there up on Mount Olympus and did things and influenced things just like big, powerful, immortal people might do. But to try and tease out something a bit more subtle, at least in terms of interpretive possibilities, to give you a sense of what it's like to live in that world, and what it's like to be able to think in terms of the divine, to be able to say, instead of the concepts of tree and life and birth and death and love and hate and anger, instead of those concepts being tied to just physical things and uninterestingly mechanical physical things, to instead have them suffused with the divine is a really very different perspective, and trying to understand what that perspective might be like, and what it's like for someone in the ancient world to live amongst the gods constantly is a worthwhile exercise. It's a worthwhile exercise for a variety of reasons, not the least of which is that it helps us to understand our own assumptions and our own way of seeing the world, and what some of the limitations are that are inherent in that. When we consider the question of the problem of meaning in the modern world, many people point to a crisis of meaning, that it's hard to have meaning in a world that is purely mechanistic. That when we conceive of the world as just physical stuff, just things bouncing around and interacting with each other physically, then that world is only with difficulty attached to meaning and significance for people, and that creates a real crisis for us psychologically. It's a very hard thing for us to deal with. And so one of the things that I want to impress upon you with the ancient Greek world is that they didn't have this problem, and that the world for them was infused with the divine, and everything was infused with meaning. And that creates a very different way of living that is worth trying to understand.